Happy Halloween. I'm dressed up as someone who recently went to a wedding and wants to write this suit off on his taxes. For this video, I'm going to be talking about the spooky web. Just a heads up, this is sort of a sequel to my last video, The Internet is a Psyop. This one stands on its own, so you don't need to have seen the other one first, but if you don't watch it, I will break into your house and replace all your furniture with slightly larger replicas so you think that you shrunk. With that said, we're gonna start things off where my last video ended, with Edward Snowden in a Hong Kong hotel room with Laura Poitras, Glenn Greenwald, and Ewan MacAskill. In later interviews, the journalists have all said that they were shocked at Snowden's appearance when they first met him.
We knew nothing about him demographically at all. It was extremely disorienting and introduced a real awkwardness to our interaction and kind of a shock.
That expected some grizzled CIA veteran wearing a blue blazer, maybe with a bit of dandruff, with a tie, receding gray hair.
But instead, they met a pale, lanky computer nerd, exactly 1 month away from his 30th birthday with a laptop full of classified documents. As you'll see, there's a lot that's unexpected about Snowden, but for now, I want to focus on that laptop. Not so much its contents, but its wrapping. You can tell a lot about someone from their laptop stickers. Snowden has one that's particularly interesting. This one, for the Tor project. At first glance, this isn't a remotely surprising thing for someone like Snowden to support, given that he was at that moment blowing up his life to defend people's right to privacy. But things get weird kinda quickly. For one thing, the biggest revelation to come out of the Snowden leaks was the existence of the NSA's PRISM program, a massive surveillance system whose tentacles reach out through back doors in every major tech platform, including Google, Facebook, Twitter, Apple, Microsoft, and many more, granting FBI and NSA agents on-demand access to almost every account or device in the world. What's more, the backdoors were so effectively embedded into systems so complex that analysts from the Washington Post concluded that PRISM could only be possible if the tech companies involved were knowing collaborators. When news of this broke, all these tech platforms began playing defense, insisting that they were really victims, as surprised by all this as anyone else. Mark Zuckerberg made a post on Facebook claiming that he would be making a very angry call to Obama, which, if you're trying to convince people that you're an innocent victim of a tyrannical government, letting it slip that you have the sitting president's private phone number isn't the best way to go about that. But in their efforts to run damage control, these companies did something weird. They joined the already growing chorus of privacy advocates who were telling people to switch over to a weird internet browser whose logo was proudly displayed on Snowden's laptop. For anyone who doesn't know, the Tor browser was designed to allow people to surf the web anonymously. The name Tor stands for the Onion Router, which is the core technology behind it. Basically, when you use Tor, before you get to a website, you're first routed through at least 3 random volunteer-run relays, or nodes. The first node knows your IP address, but not your final destination. The second node only knows the first node and the third node, which in turn only knows your destination. This is called onion routing because it has
layers! Onions have layers.
But for those of you already familiar, the thing that you probably most know the Tor browser for is being able to use it to view the dark web, which is basically just a section of the internet that's hidden. These are sites that aren't visible on normal search engines and usually have domain names made up of a bunch of random characters and end with .onion. meaning that they're hosted on the Tor network, which can't be accessed by normal browsers and requires the hosts of the site to encrypt their IP addresses in the same kind of layers as the people visiting the site. While this has plenty of legitimate uses like journalism, activism, and just general interest in privacy, as you probably know, this is also extremely useful for criminals. And so, chances are that if you've heard of the dark web, you probably know it as a place to buy drugs, CP, or assassinations. Now, the tech platforms weren't telling their users to buy human kidneys through anonymized crypto wallets, or advocating surfing the dark web at all, but instead just using Tor's built-in anonymity tools to surf the web like they normally do. Facebook even registered the domain facebook.onion. So, first of all, this is insultingly stupid. I hope this doesn't really need to be said, but if you log on to Facebook or any other account, it doesn't matter what browser you're using, these companies are tracking you. But also, this is really weird, right? Like, all these tech platforms make their money by spying on us. This isn't in any way secret or controversial. I feel like at this point I can probably stop quoting from surveillance capitalism in every one of my videos and just assume that you've all gotten the message by now. The point is, if Tor really was this incredible privacy tool that its advocates claim it is, shouldn't these surveillance capitalists be opposed to it, not encouraging its use? But this gets significantly weirder when you start digging into the money behind the Tor project, most of which comes from the very government that would soon be trying to charge Edward Snowden with treason. To start, let's dig into the history of Tor, which dates back to the early days of the internet and relates to its original intended power users, the US military. So, in the 90s, the whole world was getting online, which was causing a problem for the parts of the military that had been using the network as a secure, private way to communicate. Now that the average grandma was learning to use LiveJournal, it was a pretty safe bet that China and Iran could intercept a spy's emails. And so, a mathematician named Paul Siverson, who worked at the Naval Research Laboratory, set out to develop a way to fix this. In an issue of the Naval Resource Lab's in-house magazine, a thing that it's very cute that they had, Siverson said that, quote, "As military-grade communication devices increasingly depend on the public communications infrastructure, it is important to use that infrastructure in ways that are resistant to traffic analysis. It may also be useful to communicate anonymously, for example, when gathering intelligence from public databases." Siverson put together a team and began working on this for a few years. Partway through, he reached outside the world of naval intelligence to hire two fresh-faced programmers who would help on implementing it in the real world, Nick Mathewson and Roger Dingledine. While they may sound like the names of characters from Fairly Odd Parents, these guys were part of something far sillier, the cypherpunk movement. This was a 90s hacker subculture that offered a utopian vision of tech that was different from the ones we're more used to. Unlike the military and big tech, who, as we'll be talking about soon, envision using computers and the internet to create a perfectly transparent and predictable society, for the cypherpunks, computers offered the promise of the opposite: secrecy and complete anonymous anarchy. Probably the most well-known member of this movement is Ross Ulbricht, aka the Dread Pirate Roberts, founder of the Silk Road, who, when he wasn't running the world's largest drug marketplace and trying to order the assassination of his rivals, Ulbricht would post libertarian treaties on his personal blog, fantasizing about an ANCAP utopia. What if one day we had enough power to maintain a physical presence on the globe, where we shunned the parasites and upheld the rule of law, where the right to privacy and property was unquestioned and enshrined in the very structure of society, where police are our servants and protectors, beholden to their customers, the people, where our leaders earn their power and responsibility in the harsh and unforgiving furnace of the free market, and not from behind a gun, where the opportunities to create and enjoy wealth are as boundless as one's imagination. Like Ulbricht, Mathewson and Dingledine were deeply committed to the cypherpunk vision and believed in changing the world and fighting the man through code. However, also like Ulbricht, who received a full and unconditional pardon from Trump in January of 2025, Mathewson and Dingledine's vision turned out not to be too big of a threat to the status quo either. While they weren't wrong about the changing the world part, by fighting the man, they apparently meant working for the US military. So yeah, turns out that people who build their entire worldview around being untraceable can be pretty sketchy. Who would have thought, right? It's a real shame too, because we are being watched. There's a silver lining though, which is that it can still get so much worse. And some of the most powerful governments and corporations on Earth are working around the clock to make sure that happens. As I talked about in my last video, one example of this is a series of laws that are being introduced around the world that require the submission of government ID to visit what are deemed to be adult websites. These laws have already been enacted in the UK and half of America, with similar ones potentially coming to Canada and Australia. And so, allow me to undercut the core argument of this video by telling you about my sponsor, ProtonVPN. In all seriousness, as I'll be arguing throughout this video, no privacy product is going to magically fix the problem of surveillance. That said, if you're living in a place where these laws have been put into place, I absolutely think that you should do everything you can to avoid giving these websites your ID. A VPN is a great way to do that, and it turns out that the people behind Proton Mail made an awesome one. They have a no logs policy that's been independently audited multiple times, plus they're located in Switzerland, which literally has the strictest privacy laws on Earth. Like, it is illegal for them to retain data or hand over any of their customers' information. On top of that, they use 10 Gbp servers, meaning that you'll be able to hit nearly your full download speed when, for example, streaming region-locked content, which I don't know if anyone's ever told you this before, but you can use VPNs to do that. And right now, if you click the link in the description or go to protonvpn.com/we'reinhell, that's protonvpn.com/we'reinhell, all one word, no apostrophe, you'll get exclusive early access to their Black Friday sale, where their already very low prices are being slashed by 75%. This offer is only available through that link, so don't miss it. Click the link to stay protected with ProtonVPN. Also, you should probably turn your home into a Faraday cage and buy a gun. Anyways, the years of work Siverson's team put into research eventually paid off when they created Tor. By 2004, it was up and running, but there was a problem. While it can hide who its users are and what they're doing, if you're already keeping tabs on someone, it can be pretty obvious when they start using Tor, even if you can't tell what they're doing with it. And so, if the only people using it are American spies, well, that's a pretty easy way to blow your cover, isn't it? In order for Tor to be of any use, there need to be plausible reasons to be on it other than international espionage. And so, Mathewson and Dingledine were given a new job. Once Tor was up and running, the two hacktivists turned spooks left the military and started up the Tor Project, a non-profit that was given complete control over the maintenance and development of Tor, and whose mission is to, quote, advance human rights and freedoms by creating and deploying free and open source anonymity and privacy techniques, supporting their unrestricted availability and use, and furthering their scientific and popular understanding, i.e., to popularize Tor amongst activists, journalists, and criminals in order to provide cover for American spies. While the Tor Project present themselves as radical privacy advocates and libertarians fighting state control, in actuality, from the very beginning, the majority of their funding has been coming from what was called the Broadcasting Board of Governors, or BBG, recently renamed to the United States Agency for Global Media, or USAGM, but I'm just gonna call them the BBG for the sake of simplicity and because it rolls off the tongue better. So, who are these guys? Well, during the late 40s and 50s, a number of American radio stations started popping up throughout Europe. For example, there was Radio Free Europe, which broadcast news in Soviet satellite states like Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Poland. It also had a sister station called Radio Liberty, which broadcast in Russia. Both of these were funded by an organization called the National Committee for a Free Europe, which was founded by none other than the director of the CIA, Allen Dulles. This wasn't only because he was always on that grind, act broke, stay rich, if you know, but also because these radio stations were secretly being funded by the CIA in order to beam anti-communist propaganda into the USSR. To give you an idea of what kind of reporting they were doing, towards the end of 1956, Radio Free Europe encouraged Hungarians to rebel against the Soviets, while leading them to think that if they did it, the US would get involved and help them. That support never happened, though, and instead, the revolution, as well as the lives of thousands of Hungarians, wound up being crushed under the treads of Soviet tanks in just under 2 weeks. Oops. Another similar radio station is Voice of America, which started out doing Antifa propaganda during World War II, but changed their focus to fighting communism once the Cold War started. While Voice of America did a lot more legitimate journalism than any of these other broadcasters, when it came to controversial stories about countries the US had diplomatic relationships with, there were a number of well-documented issues regarding their coverage or lack thereof, which makes sense seeing as they were reporting directly to the US State Department. Anyways, in the late 60s to early 70s, it was revealed that the CIA had been secretly funding these propaganda outlets, as well as, spying on Americans and waging a number of secret wars. And so, facing a legitimacy crisis, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Voice of America, as well as many, many more state-sponsored broadcasters, such as the Office of Cuba Broadcasting, Radio Free Asia, and Middle East Broadcasting Networks, were placed under the control of the US Congress until 1994, when the International Broadcasting Act was passed, creating the Broadcasting Board of Governors, who were given control over all of these broadcasters with a directive to focus on unbiased journalism, not beholden to the US government. That said, while we've come a long way from straight-up CIA propaganda, the claim that they're genuinely insulated from government control is just completely untrue. Like, unbelievably obviously so. For example, the BBG does a lot of work covering state censorship and human rights abuses, which means working with activists and journalists in foreign countries with repressive governments, many of whom don't like America very much. This puts them in counterintelligence territory, and so, in 2021, a heavily redacted audit by the Inspector General claimed that the BBG had a number of security issues with regards to the foreign nationals they worked with, leading to the vetting and hiring process being turned over to the Defense Counterinsurgency and Security Agency, which, seems like some pretty significant influence. Other times it can be a lot more obvious, like how the BBG has released statements and policies that were written in direct collaboration with the National Security Council, and how the Secretary of State is just, by definition, always a sitting member of the BBG's governing body. But even if we ignore all of that shit, there's a more fundamental issue that goes back to the creation of the BBG in 1994. When it was created, the International Broadcasting Act gave the BBG a dual mandate, requiring it to both adhere to the highest professional standards in broadcast journalism, while also stating that said journalism must always remain consistent with the broad foreign policy objectives of the United States. So, in effect, still very much state propaganda, but they're a lot more classy with it now. And look, I'm being glib here, but to be fair, this doesn't mean that everything that's funded by the BBG is bad, just that it has an agenda. Something can be both important journalism or activism without directly going against US foreign policy. The issue is just that when the BBG funds something, the best that we can hope for is that the result will be at the center of that Venn diagram. One of the clearest cases of this has to do with the open internet policy. First established as part of Bush Jr.'s freedom agenda, and now clinging to life thanks to Doge cuts. The policy's real value as a form of soft power was recognized by Hillary Clinton during her time as Secretary of State, when she began ramping up the funding of anti-censorship technology and activism in order to destabilize countries with repressive censorship policies. The main objectives being to break through Iran's National Information Network and the Great Firewall of China. And so, in January 2014, 6 months after the Snowden leaks, Congress passed the Consolidated Appropriations Act, which funded an expansion of the open internet policy to the tune of $50.5 million, which was split between the State Department and the BBG. The latter of whom then gave their cut of the money to one of the CIA's old propaganda outlets, Radio Free Asia, who, in turn, created a new spin-off called the Open Technology Fund, or OTF. While the BBG had already been supplying most of the Tor project's budget since day one, this was when things really took off, as the OTF began aggressively funding a number of privacy tools like Tor, Signal, Siphon, Tails, and Lantern. All names that you absolutely should not add the hedgehog to the end of. Now, the OTF is a bit of a weird one, since from a casual look, it seems pretty chill. They put out studies about which VPNs to trust, and even made this nice pixel art animation where they talk about the importance of free speech online.
We are the Open Technology Fund, supporting the research, analysis, development, and deployment of tools and information that protect free speech.
Sounds great, but then you look a bit further into who they work with. Again, a lot of solid people like researchers and journalists. Cory Doctorow used to sit on their advisory board, but also there are a lot of people who work directly for the BBG and even some very high-ranking Google employees. Admittedly, there is a difference between censorship and surveillance, but you'd think that people who care so much about an open internet would have a problem with both, no? And look, I realize I'm acting a little bit paranoid here. Just to be clear, while I think that we should absolutely be skeptical of anyone who's claiming to protect privacy while working with big tech or the three-letter agencies, to me, the simple fact that they receive money from the BBG or State Department isn't enough to call them psyops just yet. I'll bravely say that I think that mass government censorship of the internet is bad, as are the governments of China, Iran, and Russia. Just lost half my tanky subscribers. While I'm likewise under no illusions that the US State Department is being altruistic here, they have funded plenty of programs that do a lot of good. And there goes the other half. It's also not like this is really kept secret either. Most of the stuff I've talked about so far can be found on Wikipedia. When it comes to Tor in particular, while I'm obviously no fan of the US intelligence community, the fact that they developed a way to communicate secretly isn't what I have a problem with, especially if they did it in such a way that it allows regular people to do the same. I realize I'm sounding pretty blue-pilled right now, but to me, this isn't too much of an issue unless the Tor project is actually working with the government in ways that compromise the privacy of their users or are being dishonest about their security. So, in his investigation for the book Surveillance Valley, Yasha Levine successfully filed a FOIA request for all of Roger Dingledine's emails with federal agencies, and there is a lot. Well, like several hundred pages. I'll be going over most of the really juicy stuff here, but I've included a link to all of them in the description for anyone unemployed enough to do some serious digging. Anyway, let's get into it. One of the interesting things these emails give us is a picture of the ways that the Tor project is used as a tool by the feds. For example, in this email exchange from 2008, we see Dingledine reaching out to a Russian privacy activist named Vlad about getting involved with Tor to help fight the Kremlin's censorship. The thing that's weird about this, though, is that while today Russia has one of the most censored internets in the world, especially since the invasion of Ukraine, anyone who spent their teenage years at all familiar with security camera videos of people being decapitated will probably know that back in 2008, Russia's internet was far from censored. And so Vlad responded by saying,
"The main problem in Russia at this time is not a government censorship in the sense of the Great Firewall of China or some Arab states, but a self-censorship of many websites, especially of regional organizations."
He then followed up by asking if the BBG's interest in Russia is really about helping local activists or just the general interests of the State Department.
Also, Danny mentioned that some sponsors of the Tor project are associated with the US State Department, and this led to a relatively lengthy discussion of Tor's dependence on Uncle Sam's money, and the pros and cons of such a situation. As you pointed out above, that associated sponsor is, in fact, IBB. I understand this is an ambiguous and quite vague question, but do such sponsorship bring up any unusual issues to the Tor project and Tor development process?
Judging by the fact that Dingledine left him on red, I'm guessing that it was probably the second option. There are plenty more damning emails too, though, like this one where Dingledine describes his appearances at FBI and DOJ conferences, or this one to the BBG where he reveals a vulnerability in Tor before telling the general public. But now, let's step away from Dingledine's emails for a bit to talk about the most recognizable face of the Tor project, Jacob Appelbomb. Born on April Fool's Day in 1983, as a young man, Appelbomb found two lifelong loves typical of most of the people I'm talking about in this video: computer programming and libertarianism. Jacob moved to San Francisco in his 20s to work in tech, but finding that network management didn't quite scratch his itch for an interesting life, he began to shake things up and developed a name for himself as an oddball hacktivist who'd also posed for a feature in Wired with a fedora and a dildo. I guess that's basically the libertarian version of a hammer and sickle. In 2008, he scored a gig as a contractor for Tor, where it soon became clear that he was different from most of the people he was working with. Most of the long-term Tor developers were, not to be mean here, but, some real ponytail physiognomy going on here, right? In contrast, Jake was cool. A mesmerizing public speaker with a cocky, rebellious streak, and importantly, unlike Dingledine, he didn't put his summer internship at the NSA on his publicly accessible resume. And so, while he was good enough at fine-tuning UI, thanks to his charisma and love of attention, Appelbomb soon found himself in the much more public-facing role of official Tor spokesperson. From then on, Appelbomb acted as the public face of Tor, traveling the world to speak at conventions, meet with activists, and tell dramatic stories ending with calls to destroy the government, whose funding was the source of his six-figure salary. Personally, I think all of us should be allowed to tell our bosses that we want to destroy them. Sorry for believing in free speech. Then, in 2005, Appelbomb met and quickly befriended the most notorious edgy internet rebel of them all, Julian Assange. In his book, This Machine Kills Secrets, Andy Greenberg describes their early friendship in a way that paints a hilariously lame picture of Appelbomb. Friends say they met at that wintry Berlin conference. Their paths must have felt uncannily parallel. Broken, wayward childhoods, IQs beyond those of the hated authorities that tried to exert power over their lives, and a belief in the redemptive power of cryptography to defeat those forces. By Appelbomb's fourth year at the conference, they had become close. Appelbomb told me he woke up on New Year's Day after the 26th Chaos Communication Congress in bed with Assange and two women. That was how we rolled in 2010, he said, smiling. He later clarifies that they had busied themselves the night before with programming, not sex, and slept in different beds. I can dream, he adds. I feel like reading that taught me so many things about what kind of a guy Jacob is, and I hate all of them. Whatever they got up to that night, the two soon began working together to secure Wikileaks' servers right before the site published the Chelsea Manning leaks, which revealed US war crimes in Afghanistan, launched Assange and Wikileaks to international infamy, and brought Appelbomb and Tor along with them. This association put a whole new level of attention on Appelbomb. That year, he partnered with the American Civil Liberties Union and the Whitney Museum. Foreign Policy magazine listed him on their top 100 global thinkers, and a Rolling Stones profile on him called him the most dangerous man in cyberspace. But in his now frequent media appearances, Appelbomb told reporters that he had also begun to receive a different kind of attention.
Could you talk about what happened to your fiancée?
Sure. Normally I don't talk about her in public because I'm pretty worried about her being targeted, but since you brought it up, I guess, she woke up in the middle of the night, one night, I think just a little over a year ago now. I was in Iceland working with a friend about their constitution's reform, and she saw two men outside of her house on the ground floor in her backyard, meaning that they were on her property inside of a fence, and one of them was wearing night vision goggles and watching her sleep.
We had another cat named Fancy Bear, but she died in a terrible, somewhat mysterious accident in which she had somehow been on the balcony and then tried to jump back in and strangled herself. And it's either because I didn't bring the cats back inside or because someone was in the house.
And look, while I'm not convinced that the CIA killed his cat, they would never do something like that. It did seem, though, like there was definitely some serious shit going down. After the Manning leaks, Appelbomb became a target in the DOJ's investigation of WikiLeaks, resulting in him reportedly being detained and interrogated at the airport. Although, when you listen to how he tells it,
I get taken into custody. They took me in a room, stripped off most of my clothes. He cupped my balls, stuck his fingers up my ass, these kinds of things. I wouldn't be allowed to call a lawyer. I was not allowed to use the bathroom, but they did give me lots of water. Because the goal there was to make me piss myself and become ashamed.
I'm sorry, what? I feel like even if I'm trying to give this guy as much benefit of the doubt as I can, like with the Assange foursome, at best we have to assume that all of his stories contain at least one insane lie. Although, to be fair to Jake here, he wasn't the only one being a little bit dishonest. The then executive director of Tor, Andrew Luhmann, has also said that Jacob's association with Assange and later Snowden caused the State Department to come down on Tor, placing their funding in jeopardy.
I don't make it sound like State Department's pulling all the strings, but they had a lot of sway at Tor as to this is acceptable, not acceptable. Turns out he's involved in WikiLeaks. State Department, they're like, whoa, like what is this?
The thing is, though, Lumen seems to be completely full of shit here. In the emails we have, we can see that a week after Appelbomb's detention and attempted piss humiliation, Lumen got nervous and reached out to the BBG, who, rather than being like, "Whoa, what is this?" simply responded, "Great stuff, thanks." Roger answered a number of questions when he met us this week in DC. We will, of course, never know exactly what questions Roger Dingledine answered that put them so at ease, but the emails have a couple of clues. Turns out that Roger had been extremely upfront with them about Jacob's involvement with WikiLeaks, going so far as to send the BBG a progress report outlining the work they were doing for WikiLeaks, including parts of WikiLeaks' security infrastructure. Talk to the WikiLeaks people, Daniel and Julian, about their use of Tor hidden services and how we can make things better for them. It turns out they use the hidden service entirely as a way to keep users from screwing up. Either it works and they know they're safe, or it fails, but either way, they don't reveal what they're trying to leak locally. So I'd like to add a new secure service feature that's just like a hidden service, but it only makes one hop from the server side rather than 3. A more radical design would be for the intro point to be the service itself, so it really would be like an exit enclave. And so, given this cozy relationship, it's not so surprising that the following year, rather than having their funding cut, Tor received their usual $150K from the BBG, $227,118 from the State Department, plus a new contract for $500,000 from the Pentagon's Space and Naval Systems Command Unit. This wasn't a fluke either. The next year, their budget doubled again to $2.2 million. And these guys are supposed to be libertarians. This would be like if the Ayn Rand Institute received $1 million in business loans from the government in 2020. Now, I think that all of this paints a pretty clear picture of Tor as being a tool of the US State Department. But to be fair here, that doesn't mean that it's useless either, right? Like, even in the worst case scenario where they were fully double-crossing WikiLeaks and sending all of their info to the feds, it's not like the average person is getting Tor to help them design their servers. Besides, as Tor's defenders have been angrily typing for the past half hour or so, their code is open source, so if there was a backdoor, we would know. The thing is that while that's all completely true, it doesn't mean that Tor could protect you from being tracked down by the government if they wanted you badly enough. This was actually demonstrated in 2014 when the FBI, DHS, and a handful of European law enforcement agencies conducted Operation Onimus, a massive international sweep to take out all the largest criminal marketplaces that had popped up in the wake of Silk Road going down the year before. The following year, they did it again, this time going after a massive CP ring called Playpen, which ultimately led to the arrest of over 500 people. Now, no one really knows for sure how they managed to pull this off, but Dingledine had a theory. He thought that the sweeps were, at least in part, thanks to an exploit developed by a group of researchers at Carnegie Mellon. In 2015, he put up a blog post where he claimed that the Tor project has learned more about last year's attack by Carnegie Mellon researchers on the hidden service subsystem. Apparently, these researchers were paid by the FBI to attack hidden services users in a broad sweep, and then sift through their data to find people whom they could accuse of crimes. But he wasn't done. Dingledine then published a document called Ethical Tor Research Guidelines, where he argued that studying the Tor network constituted unethical experiments on human test subjects, saying, "Over the last century, we have made enormous strides in what research we consider ethical to perform on people in other domains. For example, we have generally decided that it's ethically dubious to experiment on human subjects without their informed consent. We should make sure that privacy research is at least as ethical as research in other fields." The document goes on to list a number of guidelines for ethically studying Tor without putting its users' privacy in jeopardy. And while research on humans feels a bit dramatic, especially coming from a guy who also described the results of said research, which were probably the largest CP busts in recorded history, as finding people whom they could accuse of crimes, it's a little weird. That said, I don't think it's unreasonable for him to have ethical concerns about this kind of research either. The thing is, though, that if the only thing preventing Carnegie Mellon's comp sci department from busting open Tor is this firmly written letter, I don't think you really get to claim that any of this is actually that secure. I asked Levine what he thought about how secure Tor actually is, and he said this.
So, there's all these multiple layers, multiple sort of vectors of attack. There's timing. Basically, they know roughly how long it takes for a packet of information to move through the network, and they can they see when something goes into the network. They see this when something comes out of the network, and through timing, if an adversary is large enough that they are observing a huge portion of the internet, they can basically make the Tor network transparent, because through just by timing the packets together, and then there's the other thing, many of the Tor nodes, like the actual servers, right? Because the Tor depends on volunteers to run its network, right? So you can sort of fire up a Tor server essentially on your computer, on my computer, and you can allow traffic to be routed through you, right? Now, that's a very dangerous thing. If I were to just say, hey, yeah, all right, I'll just run it. Here, run all the child porn through me, Make me the guy that looks like I'm doing child porn. Make me the guy that looks like I'm stealing secrets from, the FBI. Make me the guy, that's a huge amount of risk, for someone to just take just because they're like, oh, I believe in, freedom of expression, or I support, I'm against, Chinese censorship of the internet or something, right? Totally. That's a huge step to take. And so what I found out was that in addition to funding the actual development of Tor as an application, as a service, they were actually giving people grants to run Tor nodes. And so when who's running these nodes, they're going to be running this node for, the next couple of years because you just, gave them a fucking grant. So it's who the people are who are doing this. You can go into their house and just put a fucking bug on their computer. I mean, if you probably don't even have to do that. These are all in Europe and America, and these are all organizations that are getting funding. Again, this is where I think, we've all become it's when someone's downloading Tor and thinking they're protecting themselves, who are they actually protecting themselves from? What in their mind, in their paranoid mind, does just a regular internet user think that they're doing? I mean, in theory, if you're trying to score some drugs, if you're doing some kind of low-level crime that you're trying to hide it from the local cops, yeah, it'll probably hide you. Mm-hmm. But as soon as you start to do stuff like Edward Snowden or these kinds of levels of crime, basically you're going against the imperial state. I don't know, it's not going to work. I don't think. You might be able to get away from it for a certain amount of time.
By the way, the full 2.5 hour long interview is on my Patreon. We honestly had an amazing conversation that got surprisingly spicy.
Amazon, I think, is a great example of the incredible centralization of power that technology allows.
It's sort of in line with the great mathematician Ted Kaczynski.
No, well, yes, I mean, it's to talk about a guy who's a loner. I don't think you can change anything alone. I mean, I think that's the key. But my difference is I don't think you can change anything alone. And I'll tell you, Ted Kaczynski, for all of his brilliance, and I wish I could actually write him a letter because I was rereading his works.
Ironically, some of the most damning evidence against Tor's effectiveness comes from the documents that Snowden himself leaked. One program called Egotistical Giraffe was able to track the identities of anyone who visited an Al-Qaeda website, even when using Tor, as far back as 2006, which was the same year that the Tor project started. The same deck also made it clear that the NSA saw Tor as a sort of honeypot that kept all crime in a relatively centralized place. This paints a particularly strange picture, not just of Tor, but also Snowden himself, who's continued recommending it as recently as 2019. And this isn't the only time when he's said things that make him seem to be, at best, completely ignorant of the content and implications of some of the documents that he himself leaked. I think that the most damning of these was an interview in which he was asked if the big tech platforms were complicit in the government's mass surveillance, to which he replied, "Twitter doesn't put warheads in foreheads." This isn't at all true, not just in the context of the PRISM system either. All of these companies work with a variety of militaries. They literally do put warheads in foreheads. Now, I've seen people bring this kind of thing up along with Snowden's time in the CIA and NSA as evidence that he may still be working for the feds or engaged in a limited hangout. Personally, I think the fact that he leaked documents that contradict his own statements is actually pretty strong evidence against that being the case. Instead, when we dig more into Snowden, another, and in my opinion, more likely explanation starts to emerge. So, have you ever noticed that whenever Snowden weighs in on politics in a way that doesn't directly relate to surveillance, his takes are always really weird? He's also supported Tulsi Gabbard, claimed Putin wouldn't invade Ukraine, and said that the Democrats should have run RFK in 2024. And like, I don't hold this stuff against him too much, since given what he's been through, it'd honestly be weirder if he didn't have a bunch of weird anti-establishment takes. That said, some of these are dumb. This shouldn't be too surprising though, since Snowden's held dumb political views for pretty much his whole life. He grew up in a strict Republican military household. His grandfather was a senior officer in the FBI, his dad was a warrant officer in the Coast Guard, his mom was a clerk in the District Court of Maryland. When he hit his teens, Ed followed in the footsteps of smart edgelords in high schools all over the world by becoming a libertarian. In 2004, Snowden tried to enroll in the Special Forces but was discharged after he fell and broke both of his legs during basic training. From there, he spent a year as a security guard for the NSA-backed Center for Advanced Study of Language at the University of Maryland, and then was hired on by the CIA, who sent him to Geneva under diplomatic cover to manage network security for the US Embassy at the United Nations. After 3 years, Snowden grew disillusioned by the agency and then quit when his supervisor got suspicious of all the top secret documents he was trying to access. He then began working as a private contractor for the NSA through Dell and Booz Allen Hamilton, and we all know the rest of the story. One thing that's particularly funny about researching Snowden is that for someone who cares so much about privacy, we actually have surprisingly thorough records of his political development, since from his teenage years all the way up until he was going undercover in Geneva, Snowden was an avid poster on the hacker forum Ars Technica. You can literally scroll through years worth of his posts, whether he's holding court posting his thoughts on video games and anime, as well as deranged libertarian screeds where he called for the abolition of welfare and particularly Social Security. Now, I realize how this sounds, and I want to be clear that I'm absolutely not trying to cancel Edward fucking Snowden for having been an edgy teenage libertarian. But actually, Snowden has definitely called out big tech platforms a number of times over the years. But with that said, I don't think it's a stretch to say that he still probably holds a lot of these views, which inevitably color his analysis in ways that I think played a role in him having a blind spot when it came to corporations surveilling us. And again, this is a belief that's far from unique to Snowden. In fact, it's honestly banal to even point out. A prominent tech guy's a libertarian. In other news, Soylent is wet. But why is that? I mean, I'm sure we can all point to stuff like hustle culture, concentrated wealth, the influence of tech oligarchs like Thiel, Bezos, and Musk. Those are all factors, but as Fred Turner argues in his book From Counterculture to Cyberculture, the deeper reasons go a lot further and get pretty bizarre. Have you ever thought about how weird it is that we have this assumption that there's something inherent to computers and the internet that will kind of just naturally lead to a more egalitarian and compassionate world? Why do we think that? Like, for one thing, we can just look at the present state of the world and the role that the internet's played in that to see that that idea was complete bullshit. But I don't think this is even just a matter of hindsight. In fact, if you go back to the end of World War II and the rise of the atomic age, the public's response to the first computers being rolled out wasn't that these will give voice to the voiceless, but instead to see them as a new, terrifying tool of violence and control. And I don't think that you can really take an honest look at companies like Google and Palantir without conceding that they were definitely onto something. I think David Columbia put it best in his book, The Cultural Logic of Computation, where he points out that while it's true that computers have given more power to the most marginalized and powerless, they've also given far more power to the most powerful. And so that leaves us with this question then. Why is it that we all have this idea that things should work differently? For Turner, the answer relates back to the 60s and 70s when a strange new ideology was taking root in America. At its core was a theory that everything in the universe is all part of one big computer. Over 50 years before Trump made the same discovery, the idea led to the creation of a whole new kind of politics, as well as quite a few cults.
There was just constantly a background of fear in the house. It was like a virus running in the background. So that, like spyware, you know it's there, but you don't know how to get rid of it.
So this is Margaret Hollenbach describing her experience in one such cult based out of Taos, New Mexico in the 70s called The Family. Female family members were forced to wear conservative clothing, perform conservative work like cooking and cleaning, address men using the conservative titles Sir or Lord, and have not so conservative sex with a guy who went by the title Lord Byron. But also, there's something really weird about how she described it there, right? Like, as trad as all of this sounds, describing cult tactics as spyware feels like a nod to the theories all of this is based off of. In order to explain all of this, let me first tell you about a guy named Norbert Weiner. Weiner's father, Leo, was a Lithuanian Jew who longed for communal living just like Hollenbach, and so in 1880, he left home with plans of starting a vegetarian commune in Belize, but after making a wrong turn at Albuquerque, he instead wound up in America. Finding himself in desperate need of cash, Leo was forced to give up on his dream of running a stall at a farmer's market outside of San Pedro, and instead went with his fallback career, teaching at Harvard, where he became the first professor of Slavic literature in America. In 1893, Leo married a German immigrant named Bertha Kahn, and 1 year later, out popped Norbert. Now, Norbert was a genuine child prodigy. He learned to read at 3 years old, graduated from high school at age 11, and received his PhD in mathematics at 18. But this may come as a shock to you. Despite these accomplishments, Norbert didn't wind up particularly well adjusted. This wasn't just due to him spending his adolescence as a social pariah around people more than 10 years older than him, but also because what childhood he did have was spent being pretty ruthlessly abused by his father, who insisted throughout all of Norbert's life that his son was in no way unusually intelligent, but simply the product of his experimental teaching methods. These experimental methods involve making his young son memorize and recite whole books when he was 6 years old. In his autobiography, he wrote that during these recitals, his father would, quote, ignore me until I made the simplest mistake. Then he would verbally reduce me to dust. As a side note, the first volume of Weiner's autobiography is called Ex-Prodigy, which is, for one thing, heartbreaking, but also, I think it's pretty funny that he was so early on the whole burned out former gifted kid trend. Anyways, Norbert's natural awkwardness, social isolation, frequent bouts of black depression, plus the Coke bottle glasses he wore in no small part to starting reading at such a young age, meant that he wasn't particularly successful with the ladies. But not to worry, because in 1926, his parents set him up with an arranged marriage to a German immigrant named Margaret Engman. Herself a professor of comparative literature, like Norbert, Margaret was also somewhat of a social outcast in America, although for a very different reason. Margaret was a deeply devout Nazi. Hey, thanks a lot, Mom and Dad. You really made up for a lifetime of abuse and fuck-ass eyes by hooking me up with a Nazi wife. But not ones to let political disagreements get in the way of what was otherwise still a pretty bad relationship. Norbert and Margaret made things work and had 2 daughters, but rather than requiring them to recite Greek literature from memory like Norbert's father had, Margaret instead assigned their kids Mein Kampf. One of them recalled that one day she told us that the members of her family in Germany had been certified as Judenrein, free of Jewish taint. She thought we'd be pleased to know. This was an especially strange thing to say, given that her husband, their father, was a Jew of German descent who would spend World War II developing cutting-edge technology for the US military. And speaking of which, during that time, Weiner found himself at the forefront of a new type of scientific research that had begun to emerge. Prior to the war, US scientists would mostly just work for companies or schools without needing to interact much with the parts of these organizations outside of their labs. This changed during the war, when these scientists were thrown into the production of weapons. Even though what they'd wind up making were violent, secretive, and hierarchical, the environment they worked in was anything but. People from all different fields and parts of a project were now expected to collaborate and share ideas. Scientists and administrators couldn't afford to be walled off from each other and instead worked together, transcending professional and disciplinary boundaries. And nowhere was this more the case than at MIT's Radiation Laboratory, or as it came to be known, the Rad Lab. Rad! It was here that Weiner found himself working and ultimately made the breakthroughs that would come to define the rest of his life. Weiner and a computer engineer named Julian Bigelow were developing an automated system that could predict the movements of enemy aircraft to help gunners shoot them down. Their breakthrough came when, as a heuristic to solve the issue of how to predict the actions of the human pilots and gunners, Weiner and Bigelow began treating them as if they were machines. By doing this, they were able to analyze their responses to stimuli and predict them through statistics. This wound up being a massive success, and so Weiner and Bigelow soon began to generalize this theory. As any members of the Rad Lab would, they started applying their work to other disciplines, an obvious one being biology. In 1942, the two approached the biologist Arturo Rosenbluth, and a year later, they published the paper Behavior, Purpose, and Teleology, which argued that the natural world followed the same feedback loops that they'd observed in their anti-aircraft work. And that was just the start. Within a year, Weiner was dreaming up ways to recreate the human brain using wires and circuits. In 1948, he published Cybernetics, or Control and Communication in the Animal and the Machine, in which he coined the term cybernetics, the name of a new discipline based off of these theories. In this book, Weiner describes cybernetics as, quote, the study of messages as a means of controlling machinery and society. If for some reason you're still not clear on what that means though, basically, cybernetics can be understood as the study of feedback loops. For a classic example of this, when you move your mouse to, say, I don't know, the subscribe button, what's happening is that at the same time as your hand is moving, your eyes are watching the cursor on the screen and sending signals to your brain, which is making tiny adjustments to the way that the muscles in your hand are moving. These are in turn being seen by your eyes and sent to the brain to make new adjustments, i.e. a feedback loop. I don't know, sounds like a cool experiment. You should give it a try right now. But while this might seem basic, Weiner's work developed a framework for understanding the world through this fundamental concept so that it could be applied to anything from you smashing subscribe and hitting the bell to anti-aircraft systems. What Weiner was proposing was a sort of physics of information. He came to see information and the messages containing it as physical things in the world, which he understood to be the opposite of entropy. For him, messages were these discrete packages of order that, despite being surrounded by a sea of noise, managed to maintain their integrity. And just like these messages, machinery, biological or otherwise, responds to feedback, but maintains its internal self-regulation. For Weiner, computers were therefore the ultimate reflection of the physical world, since, like all biological systems, they maintain themselves through the sending and receiving of information in a world otherwise ruled by entropy. Cybernetics was a massively influential book, despite how much of it consists of mathematical formulas and proposed solutions to Maxwell's demon. But what really brought the theory to people's attention was the sequel. 2 years after publishing Cybernetics, Weiner released its much more approachable follow-up, The Human Use of Human Beings. In part, this book was a rebuttal to the ways that he saw his theories being used. Weiner was horrified by the military applications of his work and science as a whole, as well as the potential for automation to be used to harm workers. In The Human Use of Human Beings, he fought against both, arguing that scientists need to stop seeing their work as pure, abstract discovery for discovery's sake, divorced completely from politics, and also that automation needs to be implemented carefully in order to help workers rather than replacing them. Weiner would spend the rest of his life as a devoted member of both the anti-war and pro-labor movements, for which he wound up not only blacklisted from the military circles that his work had influenced, but also monitored by the FBI until the day that he died. With that being said, it's important not to confuse Weiner for anything other than a massive evangelist for cybernetic systems, to an extent that honestly bordered on religious. Like, he literally described chaos and entropy as capital E evil and order and information as capital G good. And so, while Weiner spilled a considerable amount of ink warning against his theories being used to crush workers and unleash horrifying weapons, this book wasn't a refutation of cybernetics, but a continuation, painting a utopian picture of a cybernetically organized society. Now, when I say that cybernetics became a hit, a big part of why goes back to the interdisciplinary approach that started in the Rad Lab and spilled out onto the pages of Weiner's books. Since the followers of cybernetics came to see the world as one big interconnected system, then it's only natural that, for instance, computer scientists should also come to see themselves as biologists, ecologists, and social critics. This had an additional benefit, since, as I think we all know by now, if you're an academic looking to gain clout, the best thing you can do is step outside of your discipline. The rhetoric of cybernetics proved to be a perfect justification for academics stepping into other disciplines to point out feedback loops, which turned out to be great for their careers, causing cybernetics to be picked up by even more people. And oh, would you look at that? We now have a feedback loop. See how easy it is? Two groups in particular really embraced this theory, and together have gone on to shape computer technology as we know it today: the hippies and the hawks. Let's start with the latter. It shouldn't be too big of a surprise that the military would jump on cybernetics, seeing as how it was created to shoot down planes. One place where its influence was particularly clear was another MIT project that longtime viewers of my channel are by now pretty tired of hearing me talk about. One of the first pre-internet networks of computers meant to control America's Cold War missile defense system, known as the Semi-Autonomous Ground Environment, or SAGE. And while it's, again, not surprising that cybernetics would be valuable for developing network computing from scratch, once the boys in air defense caught the bug, they became eager to apply these theories not just to the organization of SAGE, but their entire department. As Truman's Defense Systems Engineering Committee wrote in an influential report from 1950, quote, "The air defense system is an organism. What then are organisms? They are of three kinds. Animate organisms, which compose animals and groups of animals, including men. Partly animate organisms, which involve animals together with inanimate devices, such as in the air defense system, and inanimate organisms, such as vending machines. All these organisms possess in common sensory components, communication facilities, data analyzing devices, centers of judgment, directors of action, and effectors or executing agents. It is the function of an organism to achieve some defined purpose." But while they were excited to adopt this computational metaphor in which the whole world could be seen as a massive information system ripe for military command and control, they weren't as interested in the ideals of creativity and collectivism that cybernetics implied. Rather than going woke, the nuclear age brought with it a hardening of social norms. As fear of nuclear winter pervaded society, gender roles became more rigid and talk of class and racial conflicts were avoided in polite society. This is described by Paul Edwards as closed world discourse, in which this metaphor of the computer came to be used for enforcing strict boundaries, both national and gender-based, turning the military, corporate America, and even the human brain into strictly regimented bureaucracies. Ironically, the backlash to this rigidity wound up being the thing that drove another, much younger and more radical cohort of Americans to embracing Weiner's ideas as well. This rebellion had two main forms, both of which saw a radical break from the status quo as the only viable solution. The first was what's generally called the New Left. These were largely campus activist groups like the Students for a Democratic Society, who demonstrated against the perceived authoritarian structure of their colleges and universities, the Vietnam War, and supported the free speech and civil rights movements, not to mention helping to spark second-wave feminism thanks to how ridiculously sexist they tended to be. But despite how radical their demands were, when it came to their tactics, the New Left was relatively conventional, focused on political organizing and actions like mass protest, community organization, and voting drives. This wasn't the case for the second faction, which Fred Turner calls the Communalists. These people saw the controlling bureaucracy of America's corporations and military and the state-imposed homogeneity of the Soviet Union as two sides of the same coin. They figured that since politics was what caused this mess, it couldn't be trusted to clean it up. Instead, the Communalists believed that a true change in society could only be achieved through a change in consciousness. And that may sound hyperbolic, but there were a lot of very serious proponents of this theory. One was Theodore Roszak, who in his 1969 book, The Making of a Counterculture, wrote that the source of all technocratic bureaucracy was what he called the, quote, myth of objective consciousness, and that in order to resist it,
nothing less is required than the subversion of the scientific worldview, with its entrenched commitment to an egocentric and cerebral mode of consciousness.
And if that sounds silly to you, well, Roszak was far from alone. Let me introduce you to another big influence in this movement named Charles Reich, who, in his book The Greening of America, laid out an extremely detailed framework for changing consciousness, a goal which he believed transcended all other types of political struggles. The fact that the vast majority of his adherents who would supposedly make up his consciousness vanguard were almost all well-off white kids was, of course, besides the point. But probably the biggest, or at least the most iconic catalyst for what was to come, was when Ken Kesey, author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, as well as the extremely underrated Sometimes a Great Notion, came to Berkeley during the free speech protests. Kesey gave a speech where, rather than encouraging the students, or at least giving them some tips on how to wash pepper spray out of their eyes, he instead told them that in politics, all roads lead to repression and conformity, and so the only way to win was to not play at all.
That this pyramid that's going on right here, like this, up to here, you recognize up here at this end of the pyramid, you'll always eventually find Kennedy or Martin Luther King or Manson or Malcolm X. At the end of this American pyramid, that information flows from this point out like that. Well, it don't. I go against somebody, right face to face against him, then I'm working for the other side. I'm just battling against me. And there's no solutions, but there's that realization of just any time you feel that and what we can do about it and how I think you can avoid it, because I think it's due. And it comes from the media. And to start a whole new thing of feedback, a positive feedback thing, we'll be having to step out of this pyramidal form, which we're used to doing because it's kind of nice to be a star.
And the Communalists did exactly that. They believed a vanguard of people living in accordance with a new kind of consciousness would act as a catalyst to spark a revolution of the mind. And so, as the name suggests, these people began leaving cities to start communes. This was one of the largest migrations in American history, and it went very, very badly. See, the organization of these experimental communities was based off of cybernetics. Like the people behind America's air defense systems, the Communalists imagined the world as one complex system, a massive closed loop that we're all part of. There were some key differences, though. For one thing, since the Communalists thought that real change could only happen through a change in one's own mind, their philosophy was, at its heart, a purely individualistic one that rejected collective action in all forms. Furthermore, the communes rejected all hierarchy, believing that they'd achieved a sort of self-regulation like a natural ecosystem. If two people had an issue with each other, they were forbidden from involving the larger group. Instead, both parties would hash out their disagreements one-on-one in front of everybody. As a result, the people who had a certain type of riz tended to rise to the top by turning these conflict resolution sessions into brutal hazings in order to dominate the rest of the commune. Ironically, by organizing themselves in such a way to remove every structure of control that they could, many communes fell under the sway of these kinds of bullies who quickly turned them into cults with the kinds of rigid hierarchies Margaret Hollenbach was subjected to. And thinking about it now, I feel like what made her description of her time in her commune so striking and kind of familiar feeling to me is that we are all now living in that spyware-infested house, since the internet, and therefore all of modern society, has been organized around the same cybernetic philosophies as those communes. We can rightly laugh at hippies who thought that dropping acid and spreading good vibes were revolutionary political acts, but I mean, think about how much of modern politics is just sharing infographics and maybe at best getting 100 people to show up somewhere. People love to talk about how great the internet was before it got taken over by like 4 companies, but couldn't it also be that the fact that it was the Wild West before was itself part of what made it so easily conquered? And this isn't coincidental. As I talked about in my last video, one of the people most responsible for turning the hippies into tech bros was Stuart Brand, who first encountered these ideas while studying biology at Stanford under a man named Paul Ehrlich. Most famous for his 1968 book, The Population Bomb, in which he predicted that overpopulation would cause mass starvation by the end of the 70s, Ulrich combined the study of biology with, you guessed it, cybernetics. Thanks to him, Brand came to view the world as being made up of systems and information, and so it was only natural for him to see computers as an important tool for understanding the universe and our own minds. Once out of college, Brand was drawn to the communes as well as military-funded computer labs, two worlds that he would go on to serve as a bridge between. After all, why shouldn't the hippies work with the DoD? We're all part of one big system, aren't we? While most of the communes died out in the 70s, it wasn't long before they were replaced by computers, as cyberspace became the new frontier for die-hard communalists to build their cybernetic societies. The clearest expression of this came in '96 when John Perry Barlow, who had gone from writing songs for the Grateful Dead to giving speeches at Davos, wrote the Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace. This naturally raises the question, right? What exactly was cyberspace supposed to be independent from? Well, governments and politics, which he declared would be replaced by the free flow of information and transactions.
Governments of the industrial world, you weary giants of flesh and steel, I come from cyberspace, the new home of mind. On behalf of the future, I ask you of the past to leave us alone. You are not welcome among us. You have no sovereignty where we gather. We have no elected government, nor are we likely to have one, so I address you with no greater authority than that which liberty itself always speaks. I declare the global social space we are building to be naturally independent of the tyrannies you seek to impose upon us. Where there are real conflicts, where there are wrongs, we will identify them and address them by our means. We are forming our own social contract. The governance will arise according to the conditions of our world, not yours. Our world is different. Cyberspace consists of transactions, relationships, and thought itself, arrayed like a standing wave in the web of our communications. Ours is a world that is both everywhere and nowhere, but it is not where bodies live.
I think that Barlow's work has turned out to be, unfortunately, extremely prophetic, laying out the real problem at the heart of all of this. At its core, cybernetics is a rejection of politics in favor of systems. Coming back to Snowden, why is he still recommending Tor? The same reason the communes turned into cults and the internet is the way that it is. The issue with Tor isn't their cozy relationship with the State Department, but the fact that individual change can't fix societal issues. A problem like surveillance is inherently political, and so can only be solved through political means. Instead, the only solution Cybernetics can offer is for you to download an app. Thanks for watching.